Welcome to a Legendarium special about the Lair of the White Worm, Bram Stoker's other Gothic horror novel. Bram Stoker, in his lifetime, became known as the companion of and manager for the legendary Shakespearean actor Henry Irving. In our time, he is known as the creator of one of literature's most iconic villains, the blood-drinking, shape-shifting Count Dracula, who lives in a spooky Transylvanian castle and makes his victims either dead or undead. Since the novel's publication in 1897, an exuberant vampire subculture has swooped around the world like a thirsty bat. Stoker's creepy count has inspired everything from ballets to breakfast cereals. Though he is best remembered as the author of Dracula, Stoker wrote many short stories and 12 novels during his storied career. His fiction ranges from adventure to romance to horror. However, only one of his works, a novel called The Lair of the White Worm, claims the distinction of being, in the words of one critic, one of the barmiest books ever written. Sadly, Stoker wrote The Lair of the White Worm during a hard time in his life. Illness and financial hardship marred Stoker's later years. He suffered from kidney disease, and in 1906 he endured a paralytic stroke that left him with impaired vision. And on top of that, Henry Irving, his lifelong friend and employer, died the previous year. Stoker had no choice but to seek other sources of income. He managed a West End musical production, worked as a journalist, and continued to write fiction, including The Lair of the White Worm, published in 1911. The story begins with an elderly gentleman named Richard Salton inviting his grandnephew to their family home in central England to study the Roman architecture of the region. Adam Salton, who lives in Western Australia, accepts his uncle's invitation and travels to Lesser Hill. Young Adam meets both Richard Salton and amateur archaeologist Sir Nathaniel. Sir Nathaniel has much in common with Stoker's previous hero, Abraham Van Helsing, the academic and occultist who becomes Dracula's main enemy. Sir Nathaniel tells Adam the story of an ancient worm who probably lived in the region before the biblical flood. The creatures, known as worms, are inspired by dragons that filled the medieval imagination and are said to foretell the end of the world. Adam remains attentive, but is uncertain if such a creature could exist. Soon enough, Adam meets Lady Arabella March, a young widow who is tall, lean, and an accomplished prowler. She wears the same white gown wherever she goes, which fits tightly over her body, emphasizing her leanness. She also lives in Diana's Grove, a run-down and ancient house. Much like Dracula's wives, she reflects a Victorian fear about unbridled female sensuality undermining male authority. Very early in the text, both Sir Nathaniel and Adam Salton become certain that Lady Arabella must be the White Worm because of the many limestone crevasses in her estate. This includes one abyss called the Well, which Sir Nathaniel believed to be so deep that it could house a gigantic creature. Her carriage is always accompanied by 3 serpents that she alone could control. Plainly, Lady Arabella is not too concerned with concealing her villainy. And Lady Arabella also sets her sights on Edgar Caswell, a ruthless man who practices mesmerism. This pseudoscience is seen as unchristian by Stoker because of the mesmerist's power to shut off the victim's own free will. And Caswell uses his power to seduce young women, most notably a girl named Lilla, with assistance from his equally evil servant, Oolanga. Adam Sultan tries to protect Lilla from Casewell, who orders Oolanga to murder Sultan by releasing dozens of snakes onto his family estate. However, Sultan conveniently brought along mongooses from India to kill them off. This is likely Stoker bringing in exotic animals that his countrymen learned of as they colonized South Asia and Australia, and of course became objects of fascination. After killing off the snakes, the Sultan men see a sky filled with dark birds, an omen of terrible evil. To frighten the birds away, Casewell flies a giant Chinese kite over his estate. Meanwhile, his man Friday Oolanga falls madly in love with Lady Arabella, who of course wants nothing to do with him. Ultimately, Lady Arabella takes the form of the White Worm and kills Oolanga in her well by crushing and strangulating him like a boa constrictor. She then pulls him down into the horrors of the stinking well with her. As this unfolds, Adam falls in love with and marries a girl named Mimi, whom he tries to protect by taking her to Australia. Lady Arabella watches them in the form of a snake with green eyes, and upon realizing that the White Worm can travel across water, Adam chooses to cancel his plans. Instead, Adam buys Diana's grove so that he and Sir Nathaniel can fill in the well where Oolanga died with sand and then dynamite the house to rid England of this evil forever. Meanwhile, Edgar Casewell murders Lilla and then becomes obsessed with his giant Chinese kite. He uses it to send electrical messages using tools he recently discovered in his estate. Very convenient. Even as a terrible lightning storm lights up the sky, Casewell refused to take down the kite. And Lady Arabella, hoping to use electricity to deepen her well, takes one of the wires into her lair. And when lightning strikes, a series of blasts kill Edgar Casewell, while a great blood-curdling shriek echoes throughout Diana's grove. The White Worm's actual form is now described in gory detail by Bram Stoker. It is a huge, beast-like worm with a body of bloody flesh burst into several stinking chunks by the awesome blast. Its remaining flesh burns and rots under the earth like boiling lava. Adam Sultan and Mimi, the two heroes who seemingly had little to do with the destruction of our villains, witness this from a distance and are glad that they and their loved ones are now safe. Throughout the novel, Stoker cites actual science of his times to offer explanations for the incredible events he describes. For example, Stoker suggests radium might have caused many of the seemingly magical events, and that electricity can explain Casewell's obsession. These scientific explanations are often lost on modern audiences because much of the science Stoker used has largely been debunked. Unfortunately, the publication of The White Worm and other ventures did not bring in much money, and Stoker's health continued to decline. Indeed, some critics have wondered if the slipshod plot of The Lair of the White Worm can be partly explained by Stoker's declining health. Regardless, in 1911, he appealed to the Royal Literary Fund for financial help, explaining that he suffered a recent breakdown from overwork and did not know if he would be able to continue to ply his trade in the future. However, the author did not live much longer, dying on April 20th, 1912, at the age of 64. Now one of the most famous novels in the English language, Dracula barely warranted a mention in Stoker's obituaries. They focused instead on his professional relationship with Henry Irving, both the New York Times and the London Times predicting that Bram Stoker would not be remembered as a literary genius, yet here we are talking about him more than a century after his death, though it seems that Mr. Stoker, unlike his most famous creation, did not rise from the grave. That wraps things up for this episode of The Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, press like. If you want to see more press subscribe, and if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.